Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's lesson is going to be on the Mexican-American War and the Compromise of 1850, which together were very significant in the development, ultimately, of the American Civil War, as the United States expanded and adopted new territories. Increasingly, the disputes over whether a state would be free or slave were exacerbated. So James K. Polk was president during the U.S.-Mexican-American War. You see these quotes here. These are by a book on Polk by a historian whose last name is Leonard and his first name escapes me right now, but that's not important. These quotations suggest that Polk very much was the man for the hour in the United States. Polk was a one-term president. He was the last president, actually, to have the potential weekly face-to-face meeting with everyday citizens. I'm sorry. You could come to the White House theoretically on Wednesday, take a number, so to speak, and meet with the president. He very much saw himself as a man of the people. He considered himself a Jacksonian, which was a term that referred to an era of mass democracy in the United States, an era in which the presidents saw themselves largely through the lens of being voices of the people and promoting states' rights and, in their eyes, Jeffersonian republicanism. Polk understood that the United States was an expanding power, and he understood that the motives for expansion were intertwined with sectional issues like slavery. And so he really understood the nation, and I think in a lot of ways he thought that the expansionist measures that he took as president, I think he believed that these expansionist measures would somehow alleviate those sectional differences. I think he also thought that it was in the best interest of the United States. So there's a few motives for the Mexican-American War that are rather basic. One is obviously slavery and economic motives. The expansionism of Polk, by the way, is not limited to the territories of Texas, New Mexico, the American Southwest, and California. Polk also acquired from Great Britain what we know as the Oregon country today, Oregon and Washington State. And these motives the motives that drove him were issues of economic motives, in terms of people being able to go out and farm the land, issues of political motives involving slavery, the desire of Southerners to expand the slave system into the Southwest and thereby protect their loose hold on the Senate in the U.S. government. There's also issues of trade involved in the motives for this period of expansionism by the U.S. government. The British were increasingly involved in Texas foreign policy. Remember, Texas actually revolted from Mexico in 1836, and Texas was regarded by the Mexican government as a territory in rebellion. And the British had made overtures towards Texas for cotton trade and foreign treaties. And the British were also making overtures in the Northwest, which is where, of course, British Columbia was divided from what we call the Pacific Northwest in the United States today. So issues of national security, international involvement, issues of economics, issues of trade, Pacific ports. Polk always had his eye on California because of the advantageous Pacific trade that it could bring, as well as political dynamics, all factored into the development of the Mexican-American War, as well as the acquisition of Oregon country, or not the acquisition, but the settlement of the dispute over the northern border of Oregon country. The war with Mexico really began largely out of responses to the Texas Revolution, as well as American intentions on California. California was populated lightly with Spanish Americans and Native Americans. There were even less people from the United States there, less than 1,000 when Polk became president in 1845. James K. Polk attempted to buy California, but the Mexicans were not in any mood to sell. They had already saw the United States as potentially encroaching on their territory. The United States was very much a complicit component in the Texas Revolution, even though we never took the step of annexing Texas before John Tyler did so, right as he was leaving office, just before Polk became president. John Tyler was the one who actually annexed Texas, but Texas had been 8 years since it had declared its independence from Mexico. This led to strained relations with the United States as increasing amounts of Southerners with slaves were moving into Texas. These territories Mexico and the United States, Mexico had banned slavery in these territories. Mexico and the United States had diplomatic issues of debt repayment, as the conflict over Texas became increasingly intense. The United States had said that following the annexation of Texas, so in 1845, at the very end of John Tyler's presidency, John Tyler annexed Texas, which had been asking for annexation for about 8 years since the Texas revolt from Mexico. This led to these controversies with Mexico, as the United States was effectively taking Mexican territory that the Mexicans considered largely territory in rebellion. The U.S. Insisted on the independence of Texas and demanded that the Rio Grande was the border, though Mexico completely disagreed that Texas was American territory at all. Polk, who was looking for an opportunity to expand the territorial economic power and geographical power of the United States, appealed to the voice of manifest destiny. So many people moving west in the United States cried for manifest destiny, and so there was a lot of popular press to Polk's decision as well. Polk ultimately sent Zachary Taylor, pictured here, down to the region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, the area that was in dispute, and basically incited a war with the Mexicans by entering Mexican territory near Matamoros, which led to shots being fired and led to a U.S. declaration of war. Here's another map that depicts the operation. You can see Texas, where Taylor advanced from Corpus Christi down across the Rio Grande to Matamoros, effectively inciting a war with Mexico. Polk's objectives, of course, were, to get the Rio Grande border as the southern border of Texas, to acquire California, which was always one of his primary objectives. He thought maybe that this move could encourage harsher negotiations. It led instead to outright war, and the United States will win a fairly quick and relatively easy war with a Mexican state that had some serious economic and political issues at this time. Here's another map of the major naval and military movements during the Mexican-American War. You can see the red lines going into Mexico City. Those are the battle lines of Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott Hancock. These were great American generals who made their name on their service during the Mexican-American War. And, of course, Zachary Taylor became president after his service, and Winfield Scott almost did. Fremont and Kearny both moved across the American West. Kearny took Santa Fe without a shot fired from Mexico, and Fremont, of course, became integral in the inciting of the so-called Bear Flag Revolt and the establishment of California independent of Mexico. It's another map. You can see some of the dates for some of these major battles. This was a rather one-sided conflict. It doesn't last a long time. Mexico was very weak, and the Americans won crushing victories as a result. The war was, in a lot of ways, a precursor to things to come. You had a lot of components of the Mexican-American War that would also be components of the American Civil War. You had city and siege warfare in some cases. You had trench warfare in some cases. You had the usage of heavy artillery, U.S. mobile units, these types of things, all of which would become very significant factors in the American Civil War, these early industrial conflicts. Disease was also a major factor in the conflict. Yellow fever, dysentery, diseases like this cost a tremendous amount of lives for the Americans as they fought in areas of the Gulf Coast that were very hot and mosquito-ridden. There's also a lot of significant young leaders that come out of this. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, George B. McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, who of course was the future president of the Southern Confederate States, all fought in the war in Mexico. And you see here pictured some of the major Mexican battles in Mexico, the occupation of Mexico City, the Battle of Monterrey, and also the Battle of Buena Vista. Now, after the war had begun, General Winfield Scott Hancock was sent to take Mexico City, and with him came the delegation from Polk, which was Nicholas Trist. He was a clerk, and he was sent as part of this delegation. And Trist was in some way the best, in some way the worst diplomat. The best because he ignored the orders of his president, who had demanded that he return to Washington. But probably the best because he got an agreement out of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that actually really worked for Polk in terms of Polk's desires to seize territory for the national interest of the American people and the U.S. government as a continental power. At this time, when Trist was sent to negotiate with Santa Anna over the end of the war, there was cries within the government from particularly Southerners who were raucous to take all of Mexico. And even though Polk's initial ideas were to take only California and Texas and maybe New Mexico territory, there was calls within Congress to accept a hardline position that could result in the acquisition of all of Mexico. And there's some evidence that Polk had agreed with this line and sought to recall Trist and change the negotiating stance in this factor. Ultimately, though, Trist will stay, and he will negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was a very, very good treaty for the United States and a very, very bad treaty for the Mexicans. California was ceded to the United States. The Rio Grande border with Texas, and Texas was allowed to stay in the United States, all of New Mexico territory, and the U.S. pays about $15 million for this territory. So it was a huge, huge land grab for the United States. The United States seized over a third of Mexican territory in a short year-and-a-half long war. And for many, like Polk, they thought that this expansion, as well as the expansion to Oregon country, might be the safety valve that would prevent some of the sectional tensions over slavery and the admittance of new states into the Union, that this could kind of defang those concerns. In reality, it's going to really enhance the problems. After the treaty is brought back to Congress, the Whigs, who Polk is a Jeffersonian Democratic Republican, or he's a Jacksonian, but he's a Democrat. And the Whigs really were angry about this. They thought the war, at this time, by the way, the Democrats and the Whigs are the two main parties. But the Whigs felt that this was an unnecessary war. It was unconstitutional. The U.S. had incited the war, and there was a lot of opposition to it. They do sign the treaty, but the fact that the U.S. basically decided to purchase the territory was probably one of the key reasons why a lot of Whigs voted for this treaty. It was unpopular. Another controversy that begins to arise as a result of this huge land grab of territory through war came with the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso, though it never became law, and in a large degree the Wilmot Proviso was a case of Northerners, of Northern Democrats taking a shot at Southern Democrats. by because they were angry because of how the Southern Democrats had kind of monopolized the political debate and monopolized the party. The Wilmot Proviso provided that all new states, new territories should be free, that there should be a ban on any new territory or state being a slave state. And this led to increasing debates over the issue of free or slave. The position taken by most staunch Southerners, like John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, was that it was unconstitutional to begin with for the federal government to ban slavery in new territories. The government had done this very early on in the Republic when they made determinations about the original Northwest Territory, which was the Northwest Territory in terms of like Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, these places. But there was a lot of views from the South and states' rights advocates who said that this was not constitutional, that you couldn't do this. But there were equally loud voices suggesting that it should be done. And so the Wilmot Proviso, even though it began largely for political reasons, the Wilmot Proviso became kind of one of those moments that really sparked off a lot of intense debate over what was going to be done with these new territories. Would they be slave? Would they be free? And of course, you know, the Southerners are really holding on to the Senate. Southerners feel the House of Representatives, because of population, the less populated South was never going to have an advantage in. But the Senate for slaveholding states was the place where if they could maintain a balance of states because of equal representation, they could prevent legislation that would seek to eliminate or end slavery, whether slowly or quickly. Another big problem that came about because of the Mexican-American War and the acquisition of all this territory was the crisis of 1850. 1848, gold was discovered in the American River in California, near Sacramento. And this led to the California Gold Rush, the famous gold rush. And the gold rush resulted in large population migrations, though it didn't result in a lot of small people getting rich. Most of the little people who went out there to pan for gold and things like this did not get rich. Most who made it rich were people who were making profits, selling things and servicing things. However, there was a real crisis in California because California was a small, unorganized territory. And it was really overwhelmed by a surge in population and a very lawless population that it had difficulty controlling. Zachary Taylor, who's pictured here, had become president. He was elected president in 1849, largely on his war record. And Zachary Taylor was an interesting guy because Zachary Taylor had owned slaves, and Zachary Taylor was a Southerner. But yet Zachary Taylor, when he became president, really becomes an individual who starts, through his military service as well, to see himself as part of a nation. And he starts to see the southern side of the equation as more of the aggressor. And Zachary Taylor begins to take a position of opposing expansion of slavery. Zachary Taylor had actually effectively, recanted his old slave-owning ways and instead became a Southerner who was a Northern-leaning president. Zachary Taylor encouraged California and when New Mexico was ready to organize themselves and submit constitutions as free states. And this really created a lot of anger in the South, especially after California hastily drafts a constitution and does apply for statehood as a free state. The South becomes very angered, thinking that this will tip the balance in the South, that this will be the thing that will cause the South to lose control when it comes to its ability to insulate the peculiar institution of slavery. Now, Zachary Taylor will never back down in this. Zachary Taylor, and he will die in office, and it is kind of interesting. We'll never know what would have happened if he had remained president. But Zachary Taylor really drew a line in the sand and said, the South is out of line, the Southerners are more of the aggressors, and it's right that these states be free states. And he refused to to change his position. And even when Texans had a claim over territory around Santa Fe in New Mexico, even then Zachary Taylor threatened to march federal troops on Texans. A lot of Southerners were shocked by Zachary Taylor. They called him a traitor because he was a Southerner, but yet he was taking actions which seemed to favor the sectional North. So the big issues about California are, of course, California, one, becoming part of the Union as a free state. Another was disputed Texas land claims. Texas was claiming much of New Mexico. Another issue surrounding this compromise of 1850 was the fugitive slave law. The Underground Railroad, which was, secretly operated by individuals like Harriet Tubman, it was opposed vehemently by Southerners. The Underground Railroad had become increasingly successful in helping escaped slaves find freedom in Canada. And Southerners were very angry with this. There were so-called fire eater secessionists, who were radical secessionists in the South, who were meeting to consider seceding from the Union. And so the country was very much at a tipping point. California and the Western Territories ignited a seed, an explosive seed of sectional dispute. So Congress met, and this meeting of Congress in 1850 was the last coming together of three of really the Jacksonian era's greatest minds. Henry Clay, who's pictured here, from Kentucky, who's known as the Great Compromiser. And Henry Clay, of course, had been famous for his compromise over the Missouri crisis of 1820, in which Missouri entered as a slave state and Maine became a free state, but there was to be no slavery above the 3630 line. This was one of his great accomplishments, and over his career he was continually taking measures to try to sow together the seeds of dissent in the country and prevent the country from disuniting. His position was largely that, we should adopt a more aggressive fugitive slave law and have concessions accepted on both sides. Likewise, John C. Calhoun, pictured here, who's from South Carolina, sometimes referred to as the Great Nullifier, because John C. Calhoun was infamous for his involvement in the so-called nullification crisis of 1830, in which, during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, South Carolina sought to nullify federal law when it came to collections of tariffs. Calhoun was a strong advocate of states' rights, and Calhoun believed fundamentally that when it came to the fugitive slave issue, that the United States should just enforce the laws, that it shouldn't be an issue to begin with. He also believed fundamentally that it was unconstitutional to ban slavery in new territories, that it should be down to the popular sovereignty, the rights of those territories to make that decision. The other player, pictured here, and you can see these pictures, by the way, these are all paintings and or images of individuals at the end of their career, so that's why they look old. Like Daniel Webster right here. Daniel Webster, who backed Henry Clay and also promoted popular sovereignty. Daniel Webster gave an impassioned plea when Congress met, a plea towards union, a plea to his perspective as not a Southerner or a Northerner, but as an American. And in this respect, he was certainly opposed to expansion of slavery. Both Clay and Webster strongly opposed the expansion of slavery, but both also believed that, popular sovereignty, the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, probably wouldn't happen because of the nature of the way the environment and the geography was in these areas. So Webster largely backs Clay and begins a call for popular sovereignty in the Western territories as a way of taking the voice or taking the criticism from Southerners away and accepting that those territories probably wouldn't become slave anyway. That was Webster's idea. He thought the land didn't lend itself to it. Taylor opposed compromise, Zachary Taylor, the president, and he was even considering marching on Texas over the issue of Texas land claims to parts of New Mexico. Of course, one day in 1850, Taylor, who was out in the lawn listening to speeches, He had been eating a lot of cherries and drinking chilled milk, and he has some kind of a gastrointestinal hemorrhage of some kind that kills him. The question of his death was very controversial, and actually some had suggested that Taylor might have been poisoned. In fact, in the 90s, they exhumed Zachary Taylor's body to do some DNA tests on it, or to do scientific tests on it to see if, in fact, a poison had been to blame, and there has been no evidence to suggest that. Though Taylor did make some enemies among Southerners who might have sought to do that. His replacement as well, and this led to really his replacement, Millard Fillmore, and this kind of leads to, if you want a conspiracy theory about the poisoning, if you will, of Zachary Taylor. Millard Fillmore was a Northerner, but a Northerner who kind of favored the South. So it's interesting because Zachary Taylor's a Southerner who kind of leans north, and Millard Fillmore was a Northerner who kind of leans south. And Millard Fillmore signs in the compromise measures. The compromise had, the debate in Congress had been incredibly fractious. It had been a hard dispute, and people weren't agreeing on things. People from different sections and different elements of their parties had disagreed on things. And Clay went home exhausted, and ultimately it was some of the younger folks like Stephen Douglas, who would be a critical politician coming into the 1850s for his promotion of popular sovereignty, would kind of piece back together Henry Clay's compromise. And the compromise really wasn't truly a compromise. Instead, what the compromise really was each little sectional interest got something that made them, placated them for a short period of time. California would be admitted as a free state. The Southerners got a tougher fugitive slave law, though there was a lot of antagonism in the North. And in some cases, the Northerners refused to enforce it. And in Massachusetts made the enforcement of the fugitive slave law illegal. So it was still very, very controversial, and secessionist talks subside briefly, but we will see later in the 50s, particularly when the Dred Scott decision becomes an issue, you're going to start to see these sectional differences and this fight over whether or not new territories would be slave or free will again emerge and lead to the violence ultimately that becomes the Civil War. In a lot of cases, the Civil War began in Kansas before Fort Sumter, just because bleeding Kansas began largely over these disputes over whether or not territories would be free or slave. Would popular sovereignty reign? So we will talk about bleeding Kansas next week as we get closer and closer to the beginning of this conflict. But I hope you can see just to what degree this expansionist tendency really exposed the expansionism of the Mexican-American War, really exposed some really deeply divided sectional viewpoints over the issue of slavery and over attempts to protect the slave institution and or prevent the slave institution's expansion. So you can really see the dispute being laid out. I hope this is helpful, guys, and let's have a great week.